So here's my BlackJack project. So to begin, we have a card class that has two instance variables, a face and a value, with a card constructor that just sets the parameter suit and value to the face and the value. And we have a getter method, getFace, a getValue method that returns the value, and a toString method that, based on the final variables here, will change a specific variable face str to a Unicode representation of that suit. So, for example, spades would turn into the Unicode value for spades. And then we have a value string that just sets it to ace, jack, queen, or king, or just adds the value into a string and then returns that final string. Next, my deck class contains a card list, and in the deck constructor, it will initialize that based on this create card array method, which has 52 cards in it, and it will generate the cards from each suit and each value of each card, and we'll generate all of those and add them into the array, returning them, and then adding them to this card list. Then we have a deal method. The deal method will, one, make sure that the deck isn't empty, and return the top element from the card list and remove that from the card list. Then this isEmpty method just ensures that the card list isn't empty. And finally we have a shuffle method, which uses an algorithm where it goes through every single card in the list or every single position in the list and swaps it with a random p variable here, and then sets that, and then swaps the element swaps the given element I with the element at the number p. Next, we have our hand class. Our hand class is used in the player class, and it contains a list of cards as well, similar to the deck, but is used mainly by the player. Next, it has a high aces variable, which is used in calculating the score that indicates how many aces are of score 11, such that it will decrease it to a score. It will decrease the score by -10, essentially making that ace a 1 in the case that it's more advantageous to the player. A score private int variable that is just the total score of the hand, and face down card, which indicates which card should be face down for the dealer. Then we have a hand constructor. This generates the card list into a new array list. It sets the highest to 0 and the score equal to 0, initializing those. Then we have the add card method. The add card method will add cards to the card list given this card, and if this method returns a value that is false, or it returns a value that is false, then it will return false from this method, and that method in itself adds to the score. So when this method is called here, it will add to the score given that amount to add, and if there are high aces, if the add value is 1, then it knows that it's an ace and it will increment high aces and add to the score. But also if the add because this gets directly from the card, if it is greater than 10, meaning it is a Jack, Queen, King, Jack, Queen, or King, then it will automatically add 11 to that. Otherwise, it will just add the score. And then this in itself returns a check score method, which checks against that existing score and decrements it by 10 in the case that there are high aces. Essentially, pushing any aces that are of 11 to 1. And if it is unable to change the score to something that is lower than 21, then it will return false. Otherwise, it will return true, indicating that that the score is still under 21. Then we have a getScore method. This getScore method simply returns the score. A face down card method returning the index of that face down card. A get card method, which simply gets the card at the specified index in the hand. This BlackJack method, which checks the score and the card size. And if the card size is of card size 2 and the score is 21, then we know that it must be a blackjack, so it returns true, otherwise it returns false. Then we have a has high aces method, which returns if there are high aces through this Boolean expression. Then we have a public int num cards, which simply just returns the card size, and a toString method, which returns all the cards in the hand. Next, we have player. Player to begin has a decent amount of instance variables. It has its name, the name of the player, the hand object, which contains the hand that belongs to the player. We have the active variable, which indicates whether the player is active or not, which it is set to false based on if they are busted or standed. A busted variable, which indicates whether it's just busted or not. And then a isDealer Boolean variable, which indicates whether the player is the dealer or not. A bankroll instance variable, which indicates the amount of money. The wager, which is simply the wager that the player set in the beginning of the game, or the beginning of the round, rather. And isHit Boolean variable, which indicates whether the player has been hit or not, or indicates whether the player wishes to hit or not. A win-lose push, which takes on 3 values, which are indicated by these final variables at the top: win meaning 0, lose meaning 1, and push meaning 2. And then simply a cannot play set to false normally, and is set to true only once the player runs out of tokens or does not have enough tokens to play. And then this object, which is simply meant to act as an object that unifies these wait and notify threads that I will get into later. We have a player constructor with that sets just the name and the dealer instance variables, and and in the constructor will initialize the active, busted, the cards, and with the hand, the name of the player, the dealer, and will also initialize the bankroll given that they are not the dealer, and we'll make sure of that. Then we have start round. Start round starts the deck, or passes the deck to the player and adds the top 2 cards from the deck by using the deck.deal method and adding it directly to the cards, which is the hand of the player. Then we have a play round method with it's also passing the deck, and if it is the dealer, it will continue to get cards until it reaches 17, and will also also indicate if it is busted or not, based on that. Then we have a while is active for the player. So if the player is active, it will first synchronize this thread, because of the fact that in the BlackJack class, it uses UI elements to ensure that the player has hit something, so it must wait for that in order to continue to run. So it also needs to synchronize that using this threadlock object to make sure no error occurs. Then on top of that, we have an once this wait passes through, we know that this is hit variable will be set, and that is indicated by another method, a receive input method right here, and that will set is hit to true if it is hit, given by this source, and if it is standard, then it will set this is hit to false, and this threadlock notify will notify that wait statement at the top, right here, and it will take this out of that wait statement. Then it will, now that we have that is hit, it will then indicate whether the player has busted, in which case, or if the player requests to hit, rather, it will then add the card to the cards list, or to the hand of the player, and if that method returns true, or returns false rather, then we know that it must bust, and therefore runs the bust method. Otherwise, it runs the stand method, because we know that that means that the player requested to stand rather than hit. And then finally, just the finish round method. The finish round method, it takes in the parameter of the dealer as a player to compare against, and then makes sure that the player itself is not the dealer. And if it is busted, then it will set, if the player has busted, then it won't matter what the dealer has, so it will automatically set win push lose to lose. Otherwise, if the dealer is busted, because we know here that the player is not busted after running through this, then because it went through here and the dealer is busted, it must mean that the player is not busted. So in that case, the player would win. And then these three cases are simply comparing the score of the dealer to the score of the player, and will win, push, or lose in either these three cases. And then here it will actually calculate what to return as the wager, or calculate how to increment the wager rather, given if they have won and if the cards are a blackjack, in which case it will pay out 3 to 2 or times 2.5. Otherwise, it will just increment the wager by 2, indicating because it will return the wager and then give another amount that is equal to that wager back. And then it will have push, indicating that it will just give that wager back. Otherwise, if it loses, it will simply update the bankroll to 0, meaning that no money is given back to the bankroll. And then we just return the win, push, lose for other use. And then again, this is the receive input. This receives input from a button, which I will get into later, and synchronizes it with this threadlock to, again, set this is hit variable based on whichever button was hit, either the hit button or the stand button, and then notify that wait statement again up above. Then we have the stand, which stands the player by setting the active variable to false. The bust method, which sets bust default and active to which sets bust to true rather, and active to false, just indicating that the player is busted. The is active method returning whether the player is active or not. The is busted, whether it's busted or not. This get hand method just returns the hand of the player to wherever it needs to. The is dealer method, which just returns whether they're the dealer or not. The get bankroll, which returns the bankroll amount. And this update bankroll method, which I used earlier, which gets an amount to add and will add that to the existing bankroll, as well as checking whether the bankroll is less than 10, then it will set this cannot play variable to true, indicating that the player cannot play the game anymore. Then we have a get wager method, which returns the wager set by the player, and then a set player, which just sets the wager and decrements that wager from the bankroll. A cannot play, which just returns whether they can play or not, and a clear method, which clears the hand by creating a new hand and sets active to true and busted to false. And then finally, just the toString method at the bottom that returns the name of the player. Then we have the, we can go to the BlackJack class here, where we actually start the process of the game itself. So in here we have a J-frame, which we just call BlackJack, and a panel, and then a main method, which opens the window of the frame first of all, and then proceeds to ask the players over here the number of players, and then further down the names of the players, and then continues to play the round with the play round method that we'll get into later, and and we'll then ask if the players want to play again. So here we have the welcome screen to the BlackJack. Then we have the in play and the first time variables. First time is initially set to true for this while loop here, and the in play for the while loop, indicating that the BlackJack game is still playing, and a first time variable indicating that it's the first round of the play. And then the cannot play count, which we derive from this from the cannot play variable, instance variable in the player class, which will increment over here based on whether the player cannot play. And if it cannot play, if this cannot play count is equal to the number of players minus the dealer, which is that 1, then it will display that no one has enough tokens to play and will exit the program. Then this simply just asks for the number of players, and then we have here that asks for all the players' names. One thing to note is that this player length is -1 because that last element in the player's array is actually the dealer. So we cannot have that here when we ask for the wager of the players. And so then we have a get bankroll, which gets the makes sure that the player has, or which asks if, which runs through only if the player does not have enough tokens, and then displays that they ran out of tokens, as well as removing them from the player array through this logic here, and then decrementing I to go back to the previous element in this player array, and then decrementing this cannot play count because that player has been removed, so we don't need it anymore. Then we have this wager where this actually asks each player what their wager is, and then as well as showing their number of tokens that they have currently. And they get the list of wagers from this get wagers method, which returns, based on the bankroll, the number of options out of this array that exist for the player to choose. So if, let's say, the player had 400 tokens, then we know that it cannot add this 500 and 1,000 option for the player to choose. And then after that, we set the first time to false, which we only used for this here because of the fact that it needed to ask the name of the players. And then finally over here we have this cannot play count, which just makes sure that that it can only continue if they're able to. Then it initializes the dealer and plays the actual round through this play round method that belongs to this BlackJack class. Then once that round is played through this method down below, it will actually run this code, which will ask to play another round if or it will just ask to the user if they would like to play another round. And if the user declines, then it will actually exit the program. Now, this is a method simply to ask ask how many players are actually playing the game, and then if the user does not answer this option, then it will just ask if they want to exit the game, and if the choice is 0, indicating yes, then it will actually just exit. And this will continue as long as players is null. And then on top of that, it will actually return the number of players for the main method to use. And then the get wagers method again. Then over here we have the play round method, where the actual round continues. We have the deck. We have the deck object created here, which is again initialized to the card array of the 52 cards in the deck, and then proceeds to shuffle that deck using the shuffle method. Then we have the J label here. This just indicates that the dealer is dealing the deck. And then finally we start with this first deal panel. So this first deal panel object, first panel, is created where it goes through each player individually and it goes through each player individually and engages in this first panel by adding it to the frame and displaying the player cards in the first panel class, then pausing for a second to give it time to display those cards, and then removing the first panel, and then continuing this loop for every player that is available to play. And now if we head over to this first deal panel, we have first the required serial ID for J panels, and then the player object. This is the instance player object that gets refresh every loop in that BlackJack class. And then we have the constructor, which just sets the border, and the layout of the J panel. And then we have finally the display player card method, which takes in the player and sets it to the instance player, and then sets the border for the specified player's card. So it will just indicate that this is that player's cards each time. And then where everything actually happens is the paint component method, which is a protected method, and it overrides another paint component method in the JSwing library, or Swing library. And first it will draw the two rectangles for each player, and then it will draw the cards themselves. And if the player is the dealer, then it will just draw the red and black, it will just draw the red rectangle in the place of the actual card numbers to indicate that it's the back of the card, not the front of the card, or that the card is face down. And otherwise, it will just display the string of the first card in that player's hand, and it will just draw that in that position of the first rectangle, and here it will draw the second card in that player's hand, and draw it on the second rectangle. And if the player's hand is actually a blackjack, then it will indicate here that that player got blackjack by just drawing that. Then we go back to the blackjack, and we realize that it will actually do this for every single player, and remove the panel, and then add it repeatedly for the next player. Next, we actually have the play panel, which begins the playing of the game, the main bulk of the game, and it will give the parameter of this, which is the dealer, because it's the last element in that array, to the play panel, and again, it will go for every single player in the player's array. And to begin, if it is a blackjack, it will just continue, because that player doesn't need to play their hand. They can just wait till the end of the game, because they already got the blackjack. Otherwise, it will set the label to the player's turn, and then have them play the round with it will actually have them play the round with the player method, play round, and set the play panel to visible, and run the play panel display player cards. So now if we go to the player panel, this player panel again has that serial version ID that is needed for the J panel. Then we have the player, the dealer, both instance, and we have static hit buttons, stand button, and a static hint advisor. So these are two J button objects for the hit and the stand. And then we have the player panel constructor, which gets the dealer, sets that to the dealer player object here, and it will set the layout and the border for that player panel. Then we have a display player cards method, which takes in a player and sets that to the existing player, or the instance player rather, and sets the border to that player's turn, this being part of the toString, and it will just string it and say that player's turn. And then here is where we actually add it if that player is not the dealer, which is why we need that dealer to be set. Then it will add that to the action listener, which this player panel implements. and place that on the J panel, because of the fact that this player panel extends a J panel, so therefore is a J panel object. By adding it to this being the existing object, then it will place it on that panel. And then here we have the paint component again, which will just paint on that canvas, and it will paint first the player's cards for each card that the player has in the hand, and it will start with this X value and just continue going by that I multiplied by 125 to indicate that it will continue here. It will continually place the cards in order. And then here we display the score, which is the soft. This soft string indicates whether it's actually a soft score or a hard score. And then it will just draw that score on the canvas. And if the player is busted, then it will set this to true, and it will just display that the player is busted. Otherwise, it will display that the player is standed. This mainly being for the dealer, when the dealer has standed, to acknowledge to the player that the dealer has standed. Then we have this if player does not equal dealer, which is just if the player is not the dealer, then it will display the dealer's cards, the title for the dealer's cards and the player's cards, the bankroll of the player, and will display a hint for the player to use while playing. And then here it will actually draw the dealer's cards for the player to compare. So it will draw the rectangle and set the color to red on one of them, the first one, and then draw the second card in that dealer's hand. And then here is where that we implement or we place that interface method from the action listener, which it implements as an interface. And using that, we are able to get an action performed method from an action event E. Action event being these buttons that were added to the player panel itself, and it will take in whether that action event has been hit or not, and pass that action event to the player method receive input, which then again gets over here whether that button has been hit, or whether the hit button has been hit or the stand button has been hit. And that's it for the player panel, and that will just play the round after that here. And again, that's in the player method where it will play the round. And then finally we have the finish panel and the final the final round, or the finish round method in the player. So here we do the finish round and we get that outcome, which was the win, lose, or push, and it will then put that in a string, and it will put that string within a label, in which that label is then placed onto the screen. And then it will add that final panel, that F panel, and that F panel will then run the endgame method, passing the player to place the player's name and the original bankroll, which is used for the final screen. Then we'll set that to true, and set visible to true, displaying it, and then get rid of it with the set visible to false, and then it will finally, at the end of the game, clear the player's hand if need be. And if we go finally to that finish panel, we see here that we have a new bankroll, a changing bankroll, and an old bankroll, as well as the player instance, and again the required serial ID. And we have the border that was set when constructing the object, and then we have the endgame method, which actually ends the game, or it doesn't necessarily end the game, but passes the repeated player so that it doesn't have to remake the object every single time, and just sets that player to the new instance player, as well as setting the new, old, and changing bankroll. And this new bankroll is the new bankroll of the player, the old bankroll being the previous bankroll before getting their wager back, or not getting their wager back in either case, and a changing bankroll, which is initially set to the original bankroll and will be incremented in the paint component until it reaches that new bankroll. So then in the paint component we have here of the canvas, it will right here, it will display the bankroll as well as the changing bankroll, which will be incremented constantly, such that it takes exactly 3 seconds, given by this expression here, that it will pause in between each increment a certain given amount, such that the entire process will take 3 seconds, and it will then display that bankroll. And once that happens, that will then continue and clear the players, and that marks the end of the round. And then when that round finally ends over here, it will again then ask each player for the round, or ask the user if they would like to play another round. So doing a program demo here, we have the welcome screen to begin with, then a dialog box indicating how many players, choosing 3. We can name the player player 1, then setting the wager for the first player, then player 2, setting the wager for the second player, let's say 500, and then we have player 3, which we can set 10 to that wager. So then the dealer deals the deck with the dialogue, with the J label, and it displays every single person's card in and the existing score from those cards, except for the dealer, which displays 1 card face down. Then it goes to the play round, which was that J label right there, and brings up the interface. It has the score and the bankroll of the player listed, as well as the cards of the player, and it will then prompt the player to either hit or stand and wait for that event to happen. As well as that, there is a hint system which will display a different message depending on the score. So if I hit, that player is now busted because their score went over 21. This being player 2, the bankroll is 500 because the wager was 500, taken away from the initial 1,000 bankroll. And the score being 15 of this 8 and 7. If I hit, that player is also busted. If player 3 goes, this player has 20, so this player can stand. And then the dealer will go and continually take cards and increment their score until they reach 17 or they bust. So in this case, if a player busts and the dealer busts, the player will still lose and not push with the dealer. Here the player 2 lost, and the only one that won was player 3, in which case their bankroll is incremented to their new bankroll. And then it prompts the user to play another round, in which case yes, but it will also display a message indicating that a player ran out of tokens, and then will not have them be part of the play anymore. And then it will continually ask for each player to set their new wager and then continually play the next round. One class also is the hint advisor class, which only contains a method that just has the return values for each of the different scores, or the strings for each of the different scores that it should hint. So if the score is less than or equal to 10, it will prompt the user, or it will hint to the user to hit. And then, for example, if the score is already 21, it will prompt the user to not hit whatsoever. And that is pretty much the BlackJack program.